The Purple Butterfly Healing Center proudly presents Let's Play Canada, a listening series that aims to give voice to child and play therapists, supervisors, interns, and all lovers of play. May the therapeutic powers of play be elevated here in Canada by highlighting voices and promoting connection across the country. Telling our stories and hearing the stories of others stitches together a collective narrative of the healing landscape across our great country. I am Billie-Jo Bennett, registered social worker and Canadian play therapy supervisor, owner and clinical director of the Purple Butterfly Healing Center in Cambridge, Ontario. Our first series, which I am so very pleased to bring to your listening ears, is our Living Legend series, focusing on play therapy experts across Canada. Okay, so here I am today with Dr. Nancy Riedel-Bowers. And we're going to be talking about a number of things, but I just wanted to welcome you, Nancy, and thank you for being here for the first Let's Play Canada podcast. We're going to be working on sort of talking about the contributions of, clinical child play therapists within Canada. And you are one of the people that I know in the region, as well as I know that you have some international status as well, with an evolution that, brought you to where you are today. And, play therapists and clinical child therapists, we all have a narrative. And your narrative, I think, is particularly interesting. And so I just am so glad to have you here. Thank you so much for being here. And I wonder, is there anything that you'd like to start with today?
Well, first of all, Billie-Jo, thank you so much for your invitation. It's a real pleasure to share what parts of my life story and how it bridges to my professional career. And I do hope that those listening might find it useful. In that vein, maybe what I'll begin with is highlighting a very important part of the journey of a mental health professional, and that is to be as truthful to oneself as possible. I have had the privilege of a wonderful beginning in life. I'm going to share that, and that's all extremely relevant to how I've come to 2023. So with that piece, I'll also mention that I don't find it a particularly, exciting time in the field of mental health, only because I observe cookie cutter models being infiltrated into what is cost effective, which is what we call in the mental health world shorter term models with goals, and they're very, very important. But it fits into the budgets of employee assistance programs, insurance programs, and all these new models that are being set up so that people can log on and get to therapy and find what works for them, they think.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'm going to leave this piece, what they think is helpful.
Right.
What I observe, though, is that people are continuously reattaching to people, places, etc., that are not the best for them. And that's because they haven't explored their life story, and that takes a while.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think that, the knowledge that you have about models and historical models feeds into that, right? The idea that people are attaching to, the next newest thing, or creating things that fit into budgets without accounting for, some of the history and some of the
the narratives that others have brought before us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems to be that way, particularly now after COVID. There's this thrust to, to venture into mental health healing, and there are some doing it who are not properly trained. There are people having conversations, I know, in other cities at the table, devising programs, highly linked with insurance programs, and 5-6 sessions or less, etc., doesn't always add to a healing process that's going to be permanent.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think there's so many factors that go into the complexity of creating treatment plans. So that's really, really important to keep in mind.
Yeah. I think I could, to continue to answer your question of me, which is the most important, what makes this healing process work. As I prepared for the podcast, and I listened to my neighbor, Malcolm Gladwell. He's very important in my world of podcasts, as is Gabor Mate. They do very different types of podcasts based on their life stories, etc. And I observe with admiration the work of Malcolm Gladwell as he talks about his life story. And if I could do that, if just for a few minutes,
yes,
I will highlight how my life story has been important to where I am in 2023 in terms of observation of mental health, and I will also highlight what was very important for me, and I had the privilege of partaking in, which is early history in mental health. So I'll just highlight that our pioneer of play therapy from Indiana and Ohio, where she died, that is Virginia Axline, was not formally trained as a play therapist, but she had the, I would say, the fortitude to train with a very well-known man, Dr. Carl Rogers, actually in Ohio. They then proceeded to New York City to Teachers College at Columbia University, where both Virginia Axline and Carl Moustakis, who was a researcher, a play therapist, they worked together with him, with Carl Rogers, in child-centered work. And so she devised, i.e., Virginia Axline devised a model of child-centered play therapy. She didn't leave us very much in her writings. We're all advised to own Dibs in Search of Self, is her clinical observation of a boy's healing, and also book Play Therapy. This was all taking place in the late 40s. And one of the, I guess, the regrets I have in my career, I don't have many, I have to tell you, Billie-Jo, because I had very wonderful parents that sort of said, you want to go here, you can go there. So I went places very young in my life to help me understand more about children's mental health and ultimately play therapy. But I did have the privilege of going to Teachers College and just walking the halls where Virginia Axline and Moustakis would have been with Carl Rogers. I found my way in the front door. My daughter was going to perhaps have an interview for grad school at Columbia, so I took advantage and walked the walk of Virginia Axline just to feel what it was like for her to go from Ohio to New York City. She ended up going back to Ohio, and my regret is that I did not find my way to her. She was so close by. There's very little about her. biographically. There's virtually no pictures of her. I observed in Gary Landra's setting in Denton, North Texas, University of North Texas, some handwriting of hers, but that's as close as I've gotten. And I hope that one day we'll find enough information about her and do a biography of Virginia Axline. Well, I guess I sort of liken her early career and late career to mine to some extent. She did what she wanted to do. She went where she wanted to go to learn about the application of play for healing. And if I could just take a minute or two to share my own early life story. I come from a small town of Belleville, Ontario, now a very well-known vineyard area of Prince Edward County. I'm from that area. And what's really kind of special in my memory was how much play there was in my early life. My father had a sailboat, and it was a wonderful time for gatherings, both for family as well as schoolmates, etc. And my family lived on the Bay of Quinte. I could see it out the front window. And so there was this love of water. And me and the friends would hang around the railroad tracks right down by the Bay of Quinte, and we would play, and we would be left to our own devices for hours on end. You've heard about those early days when play was much more free. It was back in my decades. We'll say the 50s and the 60s. I'm dating myself, but that is the way it was. And it went on. There was a lot of music and music lessons and dance in the schools, and even home economics back in the day when we would sew and do different things. There was just a lot of what I'm now going to suggest as an alternative word to play. There was a lot of creativity. A lot of creativity. So on I went to Queen's University, where I took a double major degree. One part was in theater, drama, because I had done acting in high school. And so the creativity grew and grew, and I came up to do a master's of social work in this area and graduated extremely young, but I did do so, and had my boss in Hespeler, Cambridge, Ontario, at Children's Aid Society lay out on my desk one day. Now, this is my boss of a Children's Aid Society branch.
Is this in the 70s, Nancy?
Yeah, 70s.
Yeah.
He laid out on my desk with funding galore to go to Smith College. He knew that I had some love for the play application to healing. So I took my first course at Smith College with Diane Davis in Northampton, Massachusetts, at Smith College, and proceeded to go back several summers. I then started to learn there were places to go. There weren't people around me to go with me. I was able to go, as I shared a few minutes ago. And so I went off to the Tavistock in England, where Melanie Klein had studied, and where much of her work still remains in writing, and did a week-long what they call TAVI group, in adolescent group psychotherapy. I was actually in a therapeutic group, and it was just incredibly helpful to, in that authentic zone, learn what it was like to be in a group run by an analyst for adolescents, and how it feels to be an adolescent in a group. I learned then that, I had to continue to go and find these places where I would learn more about therapy, and so proceeded through the next few decades to go back to to Europe, went to Greece, Delphi, Greece, for a psychoanalytic symposium, learned about the defense mechanisms, gathered with mentors of mine just to hear them speak, one of which was Otto Kernberg. I was in his little group after we observed Sophocles' play, Oedipus Rex. We then had these mini groups up in the hills to talk about defense mechanisms, and it was just a real gift. Not that I had the ability to learn thoroughly, but I was learning through osmosis. And I continued on visiting different locations. I don't need to go into them all, but I learned about theory, Billie-Jo.
Yeah.
Theory became my best friend. And that's one thing that attracted me to the play therapy world originally. So when I was at grad school, I had a dean, and I'm going to mention his name, Luke Fusco, because he was extremely helpful to many people. He was from Chicago originally. He became the dean of School of Social Work in Waterloo, where we were situated at the time. And he had recommended to me a few things, but one was that I should join the American Play Therapy Association. So I'm one of those people that became registered with APT before I was part of Canadian Play Therapy. And I've always been a real advocate for APT, still am. I'm a Con Ed provider for them, as well as a supervisor, as well as have become with the Canadian Association. It was a good time to be directed to APT, and I also had the advantage of doing a PhD at Laurier with a dean. It was not Luke, it was Jana Mather-Hearn, and she was my chair. She was from Florida State University, who came to our location for one term of 4 years. She totally knew about play therapy and allowed me to, in my view, do somewhat of a clinical PhD, in that I went to Texas and I did an internship with Gary Landreth, and he became involved in my career. For whatever reason, he directed me to Holland, where I did part of my research. Holland has quite a play therapy organization as well. So does Britain and different countries in Europe. But I've certainly been involved with the European system, as you mentioned early on in the podcast. Yeah, it's a part of my career that I actually don't share too much, only when it's relevant to the people listening. And certain people, names unmentioned, have beckoned me in sharing some of this.
Yeah.
So I've been able to do, with Laurier's encouragement in the past and even funding, to do some research studies that have been given REB Research Ethics Board status. To me, that means that it's viable research. Some of my articles have been peer-reviewed. So was my PhD thesis, which implies that the research was sound and valid. And I've been very proud of what I've done. But to be honest, Billie-Jo, it's been by myself. My husband has been I call him my manager and encourager in the past. I now am his, as he does some very special work in his late career. So you can sort of see, over a long period of time, there was this sort of intuitive and authentic aspect to my growth as a mental health practitioner. Play therapy has just been part of it. I had continued to do child therapy and continue to do so, not always in a play therapy zone or vein. My work in the past has been extremely long-term work, very intense, quite developmentally involved. And I just share a bit about this. I became very interested in Margaret Mahler's developmental work, who you know, and some of the listeners will know that her developmental work with Annie Bergman and Fred Pine and they published The Psychological Birth of the Human Infant, in which they talk about the sub phases of development in early life and that was used by John Bowlby for part of his design of his model of attachment. And so I went to Budapest and even perhaps I'm definitely a weirdo, but I went to where she went to university. She's long past, Margaret Mahler, but I hold her in high regard in the world of theory development. And she was buried in the Budapest area as well. She certainly was in Vienna with Sigmund Freud and Anna Freud, etc. And I became enamored by her, sort of her presence, her work. And I did visit the apartment in Vienna where Anna Freud's many pieces of her work, literally and figuratively, are still in existence. She was known to crochet for and with her patient. She made wood objects, wood toys that are on display in Vienna. It's just, wonderful, wonderful part of my search of what makes this all very important. I own a book that's autographed by Anna Freud. That's one of my most important pieces that I have in my office play setting. And in the book that she wrote, a psychoanalytical, I've got it right here, the psychoanalytical treatment of children, she talks about preparation ahead of therapy. And you and others know when I'm teaching some deep sort of history of children's mental health and play therapy, I see that as extremely important, preparing children and parents for the work ahead, because there are caregivers who become rather intimidated by the attachment between a child or children and the healer, i.e. the therapist. And I really have valued that piece from her book. So, it goes on. I had a chance to sit with Annie Bergman, who worked with Margaret Mahler in New York City in her apartment. And just for the sake of those listening, Annie Bergman sent me away with handwritten things that she wrote about peekaboo. She's has been one of the world authorities on peekaboo as a developmental necessity. Right. And it's in my office, this handwritten, and I'm going to offer it either to the library store in the Freudian apartment in Vienna, or I'm going to give it to the Toronto Psychoanalytic Library, which I've been in, because I will not have those things thrown away. Annie Bergman, who studied and wrote the book with Margaret Mahler, gave me handwritten things. She gave me a cup of tea and just kept giving me things. And I think it was, what I'm now doing. I'm starting to give away things that are very precious. So I think perhaps she thought I'd get it somewhere where it's important. And so I will do. I'll be respectful of that. So I've shared some pieces, and it's part of my career that have been very important to me. But the authenticity and doing things on my own is a piece that I would leave with others. Yes, take courses, get certification, registration, but if you can, dig deeper.
Yeah, that is amazing narrative and history that you've shared with us, Nancy. And it's like no other in a lot of ways, the way that you've almost chased the history, gone and found these places and just, absorbed almost the energy that you can find being in the places where these really greats were, right?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
I've had the privilege, my sister, for instance, accompanied me to Greece. It was necessary to have attachment, relationships, company.
yeah,
The Tavistock was, my parents sort of said, you go and we'll support you. Thank you, mom and dad from Belleville. And
yeah,
my husband continued on. And that's very important. So I share that because if people have people that encourage them, venture farther.
yeah,
Uh, as far as you feel you can, until Billie-Jo, you say, as I'm now doing, enough is enough. I
yeah,
pass the torch to a
right.
few people.
Mhm.
For teaching, I pass the torch for clinical work. And I'm privileged with particularly my daughter, who sort of carries on in a different way. So,
Yeah. Um, I'm wondering, would you be able to speak to the phrase, play is the voice of the child? You talked about your roots in, the Bay of Quinte, playing on the shores and by the train tracks. And you've talked about, all of these uh, places you've been where play and creativity have been such an important factor in the healing process. And you have
yeah,
often said play is the voice of the child.
yeah,
And I wonder if you can just say a few words for people that are listening, just as we start to wrap up.
I will do. I'm going to preface the majority of the answer I'm going to give to your question with the idea that not all children want to play.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been humbled by one child in particular who came from another part of the world, and was very clear that he did not want to play, but he wanted to imagine.
Mm.
And I, of course, being a huge fan of quote unquote Kane's Arcade, everybody should observe that on YouTube.
Uh-huh.
Caine, Kane's Arcade. Imagination is important. So this boy did not want to play with toys and puppets and art and music, but he touched his head and he said, we can close our eyes and we can imagine. It's a form of play, to be honest, but for him, it was not play with tangible items. And a
Mhm.
large part of what some people believe play therapy to be is the usage of, of tangible items. Not always. I want to read something, if I could, from my
Yeah.
own book, Play Therapy with Families. I would say, gifted with a contract with Jason Aronson. And that's another story. But I edited a book, Play Therapy with Families. And I note at the very beginning in a paragraph that I'm particularly proud of. Around the world, children are thriving and others are merely surviving. Some children have a community, a family, and supports around them, and others do not. But regardless of where families are, play provides a respite, a way of expressing, a voice, and an opportunity for creativity. In different parts of the world, children are encouraged to play. whether it be running in the streets of the Medina in Marrakesh, playing with the latest technological tablets for self-expression, rolling a ball on a flat piece of land, or finding refuge in the hills.
Mm.
And I can't help but feel I answer your question any better than with that paragraph. It's all inclusive of 2023, with video games and whatever on the computer and phones, and IT and robots. God only knows where it's all going to go.
Mm-hmm.
And as well as observed in Marrakesh, where I had the privilege of being part of an international play therapy conference and started my worldwide study there. I saw in the Medina, which is where kids are born, they live, they grow, they turn into adults, they own little shops, they chase each other in the little alleyways. They had such fun. They had nothing in their hands but their legs. And for those who could run, and even for those who would not have use of mobility, I'm sure they find ways to be inclusive. They had such fun, and my husband and I just hid in a corner and watched these kids laugh, and it was a wonderful experience. I also became very aware when visiting South Africa that Nike supports play in Africa by giving soccer balls, and kids do kick the balls around, etc. So what is a voice? What is play? What does play contribute? Yes, it can offer creativity. It can offer orchestrated models of intervention, but it can also allow for the natural aspect of what play provides. One of the best ways that I found in my clinical career was to have a setting inclusive of different avenues for that voice, and by asking the children what's important for them, rather than even the child-centered model where we follow the lead of the child or the teenager is not always as respectful as I was like. I sometimes found it very helpful to learn ahead of time that some children had a predisposition towards drama, dress up. And even in one case, and I don't want to identify any factors, but went to Michael's craft store to get styrofoam to mold a certain object that was extremely relevant to this child, etc. So by asking the child what's important for them, to understand their voice is more important than my quote unquote academic definition of what the voice is. Right. Children tell us.
Yeah, they certainly do. Well, Nancy, thank you so much for everything that you do and for offering your time here today to allow listeners to hear your story and put into context, really, here in Canada, one of the people that has been so influential in not only in play therapy, but in children's mental health. And I just want to thank you for that. And thank you so much for allowing me to interview for the podcast here today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
This podcast was proudly brought to you by the Purple Butterfly Healing Center in Cambridge, Ontario, Canada. For more information about the Purple Butterfly Healing Center and child and play therapy, please visit our website at www.purplebutterfly.ca.